welcome to another GiantSlayerTV Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 11.3. If there's one way to describe the current meta, it's that 3-star champions are really good. They've taken over the meta, so expect to see quite a few on today's list. Of course, there are several compositions that don't rely on hitting a 3-star unit, but they're definitely far less prevalent than reroll builds. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we get back to the video, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To begin with, we have reroll builds coming in as the number 5 composition. Okay, yes, this isn't specifically one composition, so we're cheating a bit by placing it in at number 5. But the meta is absolutely full of reroll focused builds, not only just for 1-cost units, but also 2 and 3 cost as well. Most of them are relatively close in strength as well, so picking just one for the number 5 spot is nearly impossible. Basically, we're giving this spot to all of the 3-star builds that don't quite make it into the upper echelon of the meta. All of them are capable of placing in the top 4 and maybe higher if the player running them happens to high roll. So let's go ahead and start the list out with the common reroll builds in the meta. Keep in mind there will be more down the list, but those compositions stand out above the rest of the meta reroll builds. For starters, we've got builds that use Spirit. That's the Diana variation that rerolls for a Diana 3 and the Z3 variation with ninjas. Either build is viable, though you're going to have a better chance at placing higher with Zed than you are with Diana. Zed synergizes well with Spirit because of his passive, and Slayer means that he'll scale much better than Diana in the late game. Another ninja-focused reroll build is Akali Ninja. Akali can be a risky champion to run because to play her, you need to roll an Akali Chosen. The difference between this build and other reroll compositions is that, for the most part, other builds hit their Chosen relatively early. You can play around them much easier in that case, whereas Akali is unlikely to be hit as a Chosen until level 7, maybe 6 if you're really lucky. Despite the risk of trying to play Akali, she does quite well as a 3-star carry, and the build is easy to run if you fill your board with ninjas and assassins. Moving along, there's a few other 3-cost reroll compositions you can play that don't necessarily require a main carry to be a Chosen. Nico with Fabled and Vanguard Mystic, for example, does need Nico to be 3-starred, but is better off with either a Chosen Vanguard or Mystic. Of course, a Fabled Chosen works as well, but since there's only 3 Fabled champions, it's easier to hit the 2 other traits as Chosen. Brawlers are also a viable option with 8 Brawlers and Shyvana 3. It's a build that you can commit to early on in the game since there's multiple low-cost Brawlers. The main downside to this composition is that Shyvana 3 is not quite strong enough on her own in the late game, and you'll need to hit set 2 in order to scale well. One last reroll build to mention is Nasus Divine. With the changes to Divine and the healing from Siphoner, Nasus makes for quite the potent carry. Sure, he only does single target damage, but as a tier 3, his damage is quite high, and he's going to heal a ton from Siphoner, making him ridiculously hard to kill. Adding on top of that, if you give him items like Titan's Resolve or Dragon's Claw, he becomes even harder to kill. All in all, there's a vast amount of potential compositions in the current meta because 3-star champions are so good. Early game, you can practically reroll for any chosen 1-cost champion, and in the mid game, there's plenty of options to choose from for 2 and 3-cost units. Whether or not this is a healthy meta is up for debate, but at the very least, there's plenty of options for you as a player. Phew, that was a lot for just the number 5 spot. But don't worry, the rest of the compositions will be much easier to digest. Let's move on to the number 4 composition, Slayer. Slayer can be played in several different ways in the current meta. We've already mentioned Zed as one of the potential variations of it, so let's shift over to the 2 other primary ways that you'll see this trait being run, Olaf and Samira. Olaf is far easier to play consistently than Samira, but of the 2, Samira is far scarier. The reason for that is her damage output is crazy high when 2-starred, and she can practically wipe out the entire board by herself with just 1 cast of her ability. But let's not downplay how good Olaf can be since he's a common carry in the meta. Whichever variation you're playing of Slayer, the composition tends to be somewhat similar. You're going to want to play at least 3 Slayers and then a bunch of splash traits to buff them. It is possible to play 6 Slayer, but you may miss out on additional traits like Adept, Mystic, or Siphoner. Dragon Soul is also viable with Olaf since he does attack quite fast, meaning you'll get a lot of Dragon Breath procs off. It also makes sense to run him with Swain for Siphoner, so tossing in a 3rd Dragon Soul is easy, or if you got lucky and hit a chosen Dragon Soul Olaf. As for items, you'll generally want high damage for Olaf, so look to grab a Deathblade for him along with a Hand of Justice or Runin's Hurricane. RFC can be helpful to prevent damage loss from being melee, and Rage Blade allows Olaf to hit the attack speed cap really quickly in a fight. Samira, on the other hand, has a lot of different items she can use. Death Cap can be good to increase her ultimate damage, or you can just stack defensive items on her so that she survives longer in a fight. While the tier does nothing for Samira, Hand of Justice is still a top tier item. In general, you won't ever be able to hard force Slayer because you need good items for Olaf, or you need to hit an early Samira. But pivoting into Slayer is a great option, so keep that in mind when rolling at 7 and 8. Up next, we have another reroll composition coming in at number 3, Duelist. Yep, more reroll builds, but this time it should be one we're all more familiar with, as Duelist has been a premier composition since the beginning of set 4. And really nothing has changed from then to now, as the overall goal is to hit 6 Duelists with some additional adept champions. Of course, there is nuance to the build, especially since you don't always need a Chosen Yasuo to play the build like you did in the past. Fiora Chosen can do work, as well as Jax. Kalista is also doing well as a carry in the mid game, with Kalista 3 having crazy good scaling. So while the core of the build is the same, the way that you go about playing it can vary. In general though, the most common path to Duelist will be a Chosen Yasuo. Look to give him items like Hand of Justice, Quicksilver, and Guardian Angel. Either Kalista or Yone can be the secondary carry, with Kalista loving bow items, while Yone is a bit more flexible in what you can give him. Duelists still have issues with scaling into the late game, so keep that in mind when playing the comp. Keeping your health high and hitting important power spikes early like Yasuo 3 is the best way to earn a top 4 placement consistently. Let's move on now to Executioner KAYLE, which comes in as the number 2 composition. If you were to take a quick snapshot of the meta, you'd basically see a ton of 3-star champions along with KAYLE. KAYLE is easily the most contested 4-cost champion because she's a flexible carry that outputs a ton of damage. And since that damage is partially true damage thanks to Divine, and automatically crits because of Executioner, she can shred through all those pesky 3-star champions. The Divine changes were both good and bad for KAYLE, as the true damage is higher for 6 Divines, but the duration of the buff is lower. Thus, you may not always want to run a full Divine composition and instead look to flex into other traits like Spirit, Adept, and Mystic. But the core of the build is basically Divine and Executioner, as that makes the most sense with KAYLE as the carry. When it comes to items, there is some flexibility, but in general, KAYLE has specific requirements. RFC is hands down the best item for her, so she can sit in the corner and dish out a ton of AoE damage. Not having to move forward to attack helps a lot, especially if you're able to use her Rage Blade, since you want her continually attacking to ramp up her attack speed scaling. Besides those 2 items, you can either play defensive with Quicksilver or offensive with items like Hand of Justice, Death Cap, or Hextech Gunblade for a mixture of both defense and offense. And if you really want to leave it up to fate, Obsidian Cleaver is one of the best artifact items that you can get for KAYLE if you're running an Ornn. All in all, if you're the type of player that prefers flexible play or not having to reroll for a 3-star champion, then KAYLE Executioner is the comp for you. And now for the number 1 composition in patch 11.3, Warlords. First, let's preface this by saying Warlords actually means 2 different comps. But since both of them use Warlords as the common trait, we're going to combine the 2, especially since both of them are really good in the current meta. The 2 builds are Nidalee as the carry and Katarina as the carry. Both of these variations are reroll compositions, as you want a 3-star both champions. Nidalee 3 is likely the stronger variation and possibly the current strongest build in the game. Katarina 3 is harder to obtain, but also scales really well into the late game, especially if you can hit 9 Warlords. One important piece of information regarding Nidalee as the carry is that she doesn't need Warlord to do well. Her strength comes from the 3-star power spike and the items that you give her. Warlord is just an additional bonus. You can get away with running her with just 1 sharpshooter and any other traits as long as you have a good front line. But in general, the best variation of Nidalee is going to run Warlords. Katarina, on the other hand, does need 6 Warlords to do well, in addition to Assassin to let her spell crit. This limitation can be problematic if you're low rolling in the mid game, but there's enough low cost Warlords that hitting 6 is usually easy enough. But if you really want to hit that late game power spike, you will need to high roll a Chosen Warlord and a Warlord Spatula item. When it comes to items, Nidalee generally wants a mana generator and spell crit, so Shojin and Jeweled Gauntlet are perfect for her. Hand of Justice is also a solid item choice, and Rage Blade pairs nicely with Shojin. Katarina will want either Hand of Justice or Hextech Gunblade to heal herself up when her ability goes off. Infinity Edge can ensure that she always criticals during her spin, and Quicksilver can help alleviate any crowd control issues, so her first cast always goes off without issue. So why are these 2 variations the number 1 composition? Well, Nidalee 3 does a ton of damage. In fact, she can basically one-shot any champion in the game unless it has an enormous health pool like a transformed Shyvana with Brawler or has Dragon's Claw as one of their items. As for Katarina, her strength relies more on the scaling of Warlords. The additional stats help boost her damage and survivability to a point where she can wipe most boards in a similar way that Samira can. Whether you're running Nidalee 3 or Katarina 3, it's pretty clear that Warlords are one of the best comps for patch 11.3. That's all for today, folks. The meta is certainly diverse, which is nice to see, but it does favor 3-star and champions a bit too much. We'll have to wait and see if the next patch addresses this, but for now, enjoy pressing D to reroll. Let us know in the comment section below which comp you're having the most success with and whether or not you like the reroll meta. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.